Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar from Cyber Threat Alliance. Thank you for joining us. I am Jason Cooper, the Chief Data Sharing Officer for Cyber Threat Alliance. I'm joined today by thought leaders and leaders in general from a few of our members. We'll go ahead and do some introductions in a minute. But the topic today is connected yet divided, navigating cybersecurity in a fractured world. And if you're paying attention, it's hard to miss the fact that cyberspace has really become the terrain of the terrain where geopolitical competition, organized crime and criminal enterprise, economic coercion, they all sort of collide within cyberspace. And as a result, it's really stress testing our supply chains, our information systems, and our infrastructure. Um, so with that, I will turn it over to do some introductions. Derek Manky, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Jason. Hello, everyone. Derek Manky, Chief Security Strategist at Fortinet. So I've been 21 and a half years at Fortinet and lead our global threat intel team. But obviously, what we're talking about today is near and dear to my heart on following the threat landscape, cybercrime, disrupting that, and also lead our public and private partnerships. And obviously, the Cyber Threat Alliance has been a very core component of that. So I'm happy here to speak with my colleagues here and hopefully have a great discussion.
Thanks, Derek. Wendy?
Hi, everyone. Wendi Whitmore. I'm the Chief Security Intelligence Officer at Palo Alto Networks and look forward to the conversation today and our continued partnership with CTA.
Thanks. And Matt?
Hey, I'm Matt Olney. I'm the Senior Director of Threat Intelligence at Talos for Cisco. And let's get going.
Okay. Well, I'll be asking some questions. I'll be the moderator here today, and I'll be letting our esteemed members do most of the talking. So, at the highest level, we really see a convergence of geopolitical tension and cyber activity in a way that feels kind of intentional and systemic. It's not really a side effect of conflict anymore. It's kind of front and center when we talk about conflicts and cyber crime, or cyber warfare, if you will, being part of that. Now, the issue, of course, is this bleeds over into the systems we all depend on because it happens on the infrastructure that everything else relies on as well. So, with that said, sort of the first question is, how have recent geopolitical tensions, such as the Russia-Ukraine conflict, uh, geopolitical competitions like the United States and China, or conflicts in the Middle East, like some recent ones, how have they reshaped the global cyber threat landscape? Who wants to
I'll
go first?
Sure. I'll step in just from a sort of high level view. I would say that it's not happened overnight. I mean, this is something we've been observing for quite a while. You mentioned obviously the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which was some time ago now. I would say that threats that we see born out of, certainly at the beginnings of these conflicts, seem to have a longer or expanded shelf life. So Ukraine is a good example, right? When we saw just at the beginning of that conflict, we saw an unprecedented amount of wiper malware and wiper attacks. We had observed a couple of them in the past years before. But, at the start of that conflict, we saw, I believe it was like 16 different novel payloads, right? So it just goes to show how at some of the strategic forefront of these attacks, there is some nobility there, some new payloads, some new strategies that are shaped. I would say when I say expanded shelf life, what we saw was those wiper malware attacks not only have a short, like let's say a 2 months window, and they're just said and done or burned, right? At that time, we see this expansion into the cybercrime world, right? Where that payload is still a wiper, it still can be dangerous, and it still can be used for attacks. And that's actually what we saw is like those attacks spreading outside of just one conflict and geo area into a lot of other different regions. So it's something, we're seeing more of this shared infrastructure between APT, cybercrime. I call it APC or advanced persistent cybercrime from a how's it reshaping strategy? I think data sovereignty now has become a much bigger issue. It's like day-to-day conversations we have with CISOs, this notion of further pulling applications, data, and now of course AI systems and models in the AI data center being built, back. So it definitely has an impact, but it's also been something that's been sort of shaping and growing over time.
I think it works in both directions, right? So you've got the actions and TTPs of advanced persistent threats and state-sponsored actors informing cyber criminals, but you're also seeing like a an approach by certain states to utilize the criminal behaviors on their behalf, and we're seeing that um, in a number of different conflicts kind of express themselves as like third party unaffiliated groups making attacks in different ways, but kind of claiming the attacks are on behalf of a certain party or in support of a certain cause. So you have not just the your standard state-sponsored activities you have to worry about, but you have these third parties, supportive actors also coming in as well. So it kind of has a splash effect. It kind of like rustles up all the actors and kind of comes to their flag and works against the perceived adversaries that they have.
I think the, points from Derek and Matt are great. I would add to that. So, and Derek hit on this some, but we see cyber leveraged a lot in traditional warfare when we're looking at prepping the battlefield. Whether that's, hey, I want to take out or I'm going to wage a kinetic attack. And so I'm going to actually take out a power substation in advance via cyber, run a DDoS attack against, a water facility. So you've got impact to citizens in the local area. I think what we've seen now a lot more is kind of transitioning that into the typhoon attacks, right? Whether you're talking salt, volt, any number of those, and the concern that they're very much getting embedded in critical infrastructure systems, whether that's power, water, telecommunications, so that they can take an effect later when we may be looking towards some sort of, China-Taiwan conflict or at minimum China-Taiwan blockade, and needing to do that at a larger geopolitical scale. The other side, and Matt hit on this, is I think we're seeing, a fair amount of convergence of tooling and tactics, and to some degree infrastructure as well. And if you're an attacker, it makes a lot of sense because why wouldn't you get the most leverage out of existing tools that are out there? It also helps from some obfuscation capabilities. I can pretend to be a nation state and I'm really on the cyber criminal and I'm getting my objective completed faster. So I think, all in all, we're kind of seeing a lot of that work continue. I would say that organizations like, so shifting into kind of what is that meaning to the, customers that we work with, more and more organizations than ever are actually taking the nation state conversation seriously. And I think the assault typhoon attacks are a big reason for that. And understanding that, hey, I can now see how my organization could be part of a bigger ecosystem. The systems getting taken offline and shut down, and really looking at, okay, we need to actually deal with this in a more serious way and prepping for how can we make sure our organization is as resilient as possible. And I think that's actually a positive takeaway.
Yeah, no, that's good. Sort of shifting gears a little bit and kind of building on what you just mentioned, Wendi. Um, you know, Organizations today have to kind of navigate a lot of different jurisdictions. Derek mentioned data sovereignty. So the question, what lessons should we take from these big incidents, like looking back a little bit, SolarWinds, Log4j, more recently F5's big IP issue, the Salesforce Drift issue. There's any number of them. That it's really sort of indicates to me, this fragility within the software supply chain, and organizations have to navigate that along with the geopolitical and the fact that their ecosystems, even if their physical presence span dozens, if not hundreds of jurisdictions. So with that in mind, and I'll go back to you, Derek. What should organizations be doing to better assess and mitigate those risks?
Yeah, so this has become definitely much more complex if you look at it compared to 10 years ago. And I'll just double down on what Wendy was saying too, and Matt on the convergence aspect and the tooling that's part of it, because these are all targets of attack as well. We know, cyber is the fifth domain of warfare: land, sea, airspace. in cyber, right? Space is also very interesting, by the way. That's an example of where we're seeing like this expanded, even further expanded attack surface, and then you have private 5G networks and all these things. And we are seeing manufacturing for a while now being one of the in the world of cybercrime, right? The number one target we see with ransomware campaigns because it's disruptive, but the targets are shifting, right? Like so when we look at these supply chains that are embedded into these, whether it's an old or let's say legacy critical infrastructure environment or something a little more modernized with operational technology, that all has a big implication in the supply chain. And, because we are seeing, as I said, not only manufacturing, but really anything in OT now becoming more targeted, that does have an impact on civilian infrastructure, of course, and a lot more, a lot more from that. Um, the fragility piece, I would say we need to learn from lessons in the past, but it's more complicated now. And I think my colleagues, on the call with Matt and Wendi, we've been around long enough to see this before, right? If we go back to the early 2000s, we saw this was a much more simplified supply chain through just the operating system, right? But just a couple vulnerabilities in that supply chase system had a massive impact, right? We saw obviously the old school worms like Slammer and Blaster and Conficker and all these things in early 2000. And I think it taught us, that managing, responding to those risks are essential through collaborations like we're doing at the Cyber Threat Alliance, responsible disclosure policies, all these things that formed. Today, we're up against a much larger beast now, right? Because as I said, we have these domains coming together, critical infrastructure, OT environments, CVEs. So that supply chain, the fragility piece of it, there was about 40,000 last year. I just checked this morning. We're about 46,000 on projection, close to 50,000. That's almost 100,000 CVEs just in 2 years. And that obviously, has an impact, right? Because these supply chains have grown larger. There's more applications. It's just a lot more meat on that supply chain to disrupt. So again, it goes back to attack surface management, looking at that risk and using tools like CTEM, continuous threat exposure management, and yeah, IASM, EASM to be able to identify that and tackle it without having to hire 20 or 30 analysts in your SOC, right?
I think there's a couple of different supply chain types, right, that you mentioned, where you have like SolarWinds, where it's like your partner and your support in IT is helping you. And then you have something like Log4j, where like an underlying library is going to be a problem for you throughout your enterprise. And I think looking at those kind of collectively and then thinking about how we're entering like a multipolar world where there's going to be different areas of control, I think as we're designing networks and as we're designing disaster relief plans and incident response plans, part of what we have to learn is what can we do without. Like if you are a critical infrastructure organization, how long can you do without internet and still fulfill your obligations to the community that you're serving? I think it's your entire design philosophy kind of has to change. You're looking at, we don't have the dependence that we have and the faith that we've had in things before, and when we lose faith in things, we have to adjust and create controls that adapt to them. And I think that's where the supply chain things are coming in. We've tried to address it with like SBOMs to make it easier to understand when there's something wrong, how it affects you in the enterprise. But ultimately, you have to have a response to things that you potentially can't control. If there's a problem in Log4j and there isn't a patch quickly coming, how long can you operate? What do you have to block? What capabilities do you have and controls can you put in place? Having gateways and controls and visibility is much more important today than it was in the past. Derek talked about like the early 2000s, and like it was typically at one point in the very, very early 2000s, like strictly a server game almost before the early Adobe phones, right? And so your visibility kind of could be shaped towards the front, and like an IPS and a firewall would get you a long way. Nowadays, with social engineering attacks and the the supply chain attacks, and you never know where that problem's going to pop up or source from within your organization. You have to have gateways and controls and visibility throughout your organization to adapt to the kind of threats that we're talking about.
I think, we're hitting on like everything is more interconnected than it ever has been. So, there's all these measures where we're taking place, right? We're talking about SBOMs and the need for that. I completely agree with that. I think, unfortunately, as we look at, this rapid AI implementation, it's becoming more and more challenging for most organizations to really have, lock down their environments. And so when we look at like what's the reality today for a CISO in a medium to large organization, their teams want to, on the business side, want to innovate as quickly as possible. So they want to adopt new technologies, sometimes on a weekly basis. The security team is largely the part of the organization that's now required to, be reviewing the contracts, doing testing for use cases to make sure that, the use cases the business wants to use, that the actual technologies are going to be safe for that. And so we've added this massive amount of workload to the security teams that they probably didn't even predict like 12 months ago in terms of as part of their planning roadmap. And so I think we are going to, the supply chain issue of the question becomes even more complex now because you've got the actual LLM and third-party provider, but they've got their whole ecosystem of libraries and providers and vendors that they're working with. And so I am concerned that that's becoming a harder task for most CISOs than an easier task. And I think that's something that we need to, collectively be looking at. Like, in an organization like CTA, I think is a great example. Can we look at kind of shifting some of the burden, if you will, of the actual evaluation of these new technologies to more of an industry body that financial services could use and know that, hey, this organization certified it. I don't need to, as a medium-sized bank, do the same level of certification and justification for the same use case that maybe 5 to 10 other major banks have already done, for example. So I think that's to me, I'm really vocal about, hey, how can we simplify this moving forward? Because I think that's going to become an even bigger challenge for all of us.
Right. Yeah, those are great comments from all of you. Shifting gears a little bit more, that was, looking closely more at supply chains and kind of organizational response. I want to talk a little bit about the overlap between the world we talked about before, the sort of geopolitical tensions and those things, with the sort of innovation economy that exists around cybercrime as a service. We've seen a lot of growth in specialization, marketplace, criminal level agreements, service level agreements, right? Um, and there's also the sort of challenge of attribution within all of this, where there's sort of the asymmetry and the overlapping, I should say, of the economy of cybercrime and nation states and all of the conflicts and stuff we talked about before. So like I'm thinking about, how do we work to put up the right choke points while navigating the complexity of this, so again, sort of asymmetric world. And, how can we motivate legitimate industry actors to help sort of work together to close these choke points as we move forward? Derek, any thoughts on that?
Sure. A lot of thoughts. So I think a couple of things here, right? As we know, we all talk about this all the time, the cyber criminal ecosystem, dark web marketplaces, the targets and motivations, and just simply the amount of players. I'm talking about cybercrime again, not the nation states, of course, are having an impact on several things, right? One, because of the targets and the supply chain that we just talked about, it is transforming the role of the CISO that we know today. I mean, more stuff gets packed on, right? But it's really becoming this new sort of chief risk officer role, not just the security officer, because there's a huge element of risk to that, and that comes with all that supply chain navigation, incident response planning for that, as Matt was saying, right? And then as Wendy was saying, yes, I mean AI now, of course, just because of the mass adoption. When the industry always gets this sort of backwards, right? There's a big hype cycle and huge adoption, and it's like, okay, now we have data privacy issues, data loss prevention issues. We have, security issues for attacks on these AI systems themselves. How do we start securing those? Prompt injection attacks, all those different things, right? RAG attacks. So that's one thing that's really that's challenging sort of the response to all this from a security standpoint. I think now when it comes to disrupting those attacks, it's no secret. We've talked about this at the CTA forever. It's just easier said than done, right? Information sharing is not easy. It's difficult. The right information sharing, right? When it comes to identifying and doing attribution, having a response plan to disrupt these ecosystems. And I think we've made progress in the industry, and there's good examples of this, right? If you look at obviously the Cyber Threat Alliance, the whole vision and the mission statement right from day one was to team up with collaborators in the industry, share intelligence, and increase the resiliency of security stacks and data centers and all these other sort of choke points in the world. And that's great. That's a great, and that's been fantastic how the way it's played out. But that's also one element. So I think now when it comes to disrupting cybercrime, we're in this, okay, we always talk about public-private partnerships. CTA is a stakeholder within the private sector for sharing, but you have all these other stakeholders, right? With obviously law enforcement, with the research doing for mapping these cybercriminal ecosystems. Cybercrime Atlas is a good example of that. And there's sort of this chain of disruption, right, that needs to be built, and that includes actually going after trying to do that attribution, not just looking at IOCs. I know this URI or IP address or some TTPs and tactics associated to an actor, and that is my golden ticket to attribute this actor. I think it's also looking at all these different elements like crypto wallets, the domain registrars, what telco providers are using, bulletproof holsters, crypto exchanges, like I said, all these different things. And so it becomes more complex, but it's what's happening is that these collaborations truly have to happen at scale, like at a multinational connected level. That's sort of the end game where we need to get to. Right now, you have a lot of great efforts that are regional in nature. So it's a matter of trying to solve data privacy issues when it comes to information sharing and disruption, but then also to take that basically at a global scale. And there are some great examples. So I mentioned Cyber Threat Alliance. There's GASA, like the Global Anti-Scam Alliance, Interpol's Gateway, Cybercrime Atlas. The list goes on. It's actually a large list. So I think there's been promise of the way that we've approached that, but there's still a lot of work to be done because the economics of cybercrime, this industrialization, it's just massive right now. No one can put an exact fingerprint on it, but of course, we always talk about the trillions of dollars of damages that are occurring and are projected to still occur too.
I think the the scope and speed of change right now really puts, for me, thinking about what defenders should be doing, kind of puts the onus on the defender to know themselves. Like, so Derek said earlier, like there's 100,000 CVs in the last 2 years or so. Like, hopefully very few of those CVs are relevant to you, right? But you have to know that. And it doesn't matter if you have a robust cyber intelligence program with lots of partnerships and you have friends here and there and you're always getting information in. If you don't have the capacity to take that information and reflect it against your own organization, it's incredibly important to get transparency inside of your organization so that each of these changes in the threat landscape comes up, you can decide, okay, how much panic do I have to have? And then you have to test your knowledge of those systems. I think I'm a big fan of like red teaming your organization, tabletop exercises in your organization to point out to you as a CISO or as a SOC leader, like where are your gaps? Like the most important thing for you to know isn't necessarily what the attribution of a certain actor is, but to know that you have blind spots and that you've adapted for those blind spots. And I think that right now, being able to take in information quickly is important, but being able to contextualize that information to your organization is the skill that kind of puts a some organizations on the good side of the line and some organizations on the bad side of the line.
I think those are certainly great points. Organizations are much more effective when they can actually implement the actions that Matt highlighted. I think our in terms of like how do we change attacker behavior and ideally cause disruption. Organizations like the four of ours represented here, as well as many of our industry peers and the government, I think regularly work together to conduct disruptive operations. Those are a big part of what we do, and I think very important. But the reality is that the entire incentive structure for attackers versus defenders really needs to change. And it's not just at a US national level, it's really at a global level. So, at a US level, that's working closely together with these public-private partnerships so that we can actually bring true disruption that's going to last more than a few hours or more than a few days, to infrastructure. Actually, at an international level, it's going after the countries where a lot of times many of these attackers are safe harbored, making sure that we can actually kind of bring some legitimate disincentivization. I'll say that. I'll keep it a very high level, broad term, but to the behaviors that these attackers are conducting. Because right now, it's much cheaper for them, by and large, to conduct successful operations against organizations who have to defend them. And attackers are not mired in jurisdictional rules, in notification and compliance and regulatory bodies and the 50 states, let's say in the US, with different privacy laws, potentially now looking at different AI regulation in each state versus one federal regulation. Attackers aren't stymied by any of that. And so they're going to continue to be able to move faster and at a larger scale. I think AI, from a technical capability perspective and a detection and response, is really a key for defenders here. But the problem to me is so much bigger and so much more at kind of a policy level and how we look at, leading the world with our allies in terms of how can we actually create disruption and make it so that to use the supply chain analogy as well, when we look at like this kind of younger pool of talent, if you will, a lot of them now, these kind of vulnerable populations who get really pulled into cybercrime, they're being targeted by organizations that are funded by, drug cartels and organizations that have a lot of money. They're being pulled into the dark side. I think we as an industry across the globe really need to be looking at like, how can we make the field exciting to pull in people who are extremely talented that would otherwise kind of go down a negative path and actually pull them to the defense side. And that's an area where I think our work is incredibly interesting and exciting. And that's an area that I think we could focus on to potentially help further downstream as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, that's really interesting.
But
Oh, go ahead, Derek. I'm
no, I was
sorry.
just gonna say I love that you said that, Wendy. I completely agree, and I think this is something we don't talk about enough. I mean, yes, we talk about the nation states, we talk about the scattered spiders and the lock bits and so forth, right? And that definitely is an issue on disruption. But these sort of three pillars of the incentives definitely need to be unpacked and worked on a lot. And accountability. I mean, that comes sort of from the incentivization, how we do disruption, but then the deterrence too. I agree. I think that's a massive issue because we already have this this picture that we see today with all the malicious actors out there, and we're always just trying to do our work to do that attribution to help with disruption. But now you have this whole next generation. If we don't solve that root cause issue, so like youth getting into cybercrime, there's not enough deterrence models, and they say, hey, look, this is a huge profitable industry. It's an easy way for me to make a buck, and this is what I want to be when I grow up. That's not the right message to send, right? So I think, yeah, the deterrence, particularly in youth and education around that, is a very, very crucial concept moving forward too.
Yeah, no, lots of great points there. And that actually segues nicely into the sort of next thing I wanted to talk about. I'll just had a couple comments. I actually was at the Global Anti-Scam Alliance conference a couple weeks ago in the DC area. Derek mentioned them earlier, and as someone who's been going to cybersecurity conferences for decades now, that was the first one I've ever been at where it really struck me sort of the breadth of the overall problem. There were presentations by AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. There were social workers there. There were people from the State Department there, and it sort of showed to me how broad the impact of this is. And I was actually on a panel, and one of the things I mentioned, uh, Matt mentioned earlier, the quantifying this problem, right? CTA actually did a paper, a joint paper with Cyber Green and Zurich Insurance Group, where the estimate from Zurich is that it's a $1 trillion number that, in terms of the impact, but only like 10% of that is actually insured. So the true loss to people beyond that is most of the brunt is being borne by the victims, and most of them are not large enterprises. They're individual people. Um, anyhow, enough of my comments. So I want to talk a little bit about what has worked and where there's been some progress and some success to celebrate. One thing that comes to mind, and I'll point to you, Derek, on this one to start with. How do frameworks such as the Cybercrime Atlas enable the ability to sort of scale around this problem, not just sharing information, but actually turning that information into coordinated action, whether that be disruption or actual law enforcement type actions.
Yeah, Cybercrime Atlas started as a proof of concept 4 years ago, and it was just this notion of can we try to break down some of those data sharing barriers that we have to focus purely on OSINT, right, on open source intelligence, but obviously then bring all these different subject matter experts within that ecosystem we just talked about, right? So cryptocurrency experts, security researchers, financial services, all of those coming under one roof to really do this like mapped, disrupt, and shape exercise. So obviously, first picking just a couple of these targets, not boiling the ocean, right? But looking at some of the key drivers like business email compromise or ransomware, picking some of the targets, and then building through human vetted data points, a map of that ecosystem, potential players involved, different business units, so that a more strategic disruption plan can be put together instead of, as Wendy said, just like taking down infrastructure and then it's the whack-a-mole game we always talk about and back up a couple days later, right? So truly having that hit them in all their choke points, like where it hurts, all holistically at once, and having those stakeholders together. So we kind of bit off more than we could chew with that. I mean, in the first year, we picked too many targets, but we did find some interesting things. We presented it at RSA, and it got enough interest to be able to put some funding into it and basically get an operational model set up. So I think it's a good example. The last 3 years now, there's been over 30,000 of these human vetted data points. There's been well over 20 cumulatively, 20 intelligence packages that have been formed as a result of this that have been operationally passed to law enforcement, presented in there. So it's sort of this pass off of like, let's take some of the burden of law enforcement having to do all this to let's have a collective research pool together and help uplift that so we can inject that into some of their operational cycles. So that definitely helps as a force multiplier. And Interpol's put out some great releases on Operation Serengeti last year and Serengeti 2.0 this year. Between those two operations, there's about nearly $200 million US recovered to victims. And Serengeti 2.0 just this year, there were about 88,000 victims impacted, over 1,200 arrests that were done. And this was infrastructure takedown, but arrests also, and going back and trying to recover some of the funds. So it's an example of, again, that disruption is not just arresting people or taking them, infrastructure offline. It's also this the victim aspect too, right? Trying to help with them. So I think it's a good example. There's over 70 volunteers in the organization now, in the initiative, sorry. Um, but again, yeah, it's still 3 years in, and we talk about this, what we're trying to achieve globally, and like the scale of cybercrime is just massive right now. So it comes back to the incentives to me. Again, it's great to have volunteers, but the more that we work on those incentive models, I think these initiatives are just going to get stronger and stronger.
Yeah, kind of building on that, and then I'll put the question more to first start with Wendi. We talked about Derek gave examples of some things that have worked, even though the problem is still scaled out much beyond what we can do with a project like that. But where should we be going with this? Where do cyber diplomacy, international alliances, where should they come into play in the collective response towards these threats?
I think they're more critical than ever because, as Derek mentioned, you're right, that problem just continues to scale. So, I think there's kind of two components of that. One on the technology side, like we can really only fight this level of scale with machine speed. So, attacking the problem from building AI into our cyber detections, we've seen that work time and again at our own SOC. Like just the volumes are kind of eye-watering of the data that we get on a day-to-day basis. We're dealing with 90 billion attack events, so potential events per day coming into our SOC. Filtering that into 26,000 that are actually truly relevant to what's going on and that we need to apply a lot more deep learning to. And then ideally one per day that we're actually filtering to a human who's doing a level, tier 3 level of analysis. So just to kind of give an example, that's one organization. Granted, our organization's big and we're also defending customers throughout the world, but that's the kind of scale that people are looking at having to defend against. And we're going to just see that continue to increase with the level of capability that attackers are going to have just using AI to speed their attacks and then make the breadth of it more easy. So that's kind of number one, which is the technology side of it. And I think that becomes fundamental. And we've got to figure out a way to make sure that organizations throughout the world, big and small, can have that level of capability and they're not thwarted, just due to size and limited resources. Then I think the second is really what you talked about, that diplomacy piece. So the policy level. So within the US, we look at public and private partnerships. We look at government organizations sharing intelligence across individual organizations in a much more robust manner. I know that's top of mind for the administration today. And then taking that to a global level, it's looking at not only continuing to work closely with our allies, but how can we, when we talk about the incentive structure, what we really mean is like attackers can make a lot of money and take relatively little risk based on where they may live and what government they're governed by throughout the world. And so how do we bridge some of those gaps with countries that aren't traditionally our allies and change that incentive structure so they're on the same page with not harboring those criminals and looking at actually changing laws in a more global perspective. So, I think the work that all of the teams are doing with Interpol, for example, is a great example of that. They're really trying to kind of work across barriers throughout the world and not look at like, hey, what, maybe we don't agree on all of these politics, but it's ultimately at the end of the day, like, hey, can we define criminal law and actually go after people under those laws so that we can actually start looking at making a change and creating a different impact.
Matt, anything you'd like to add to that topic?
Um, I think it's just important to recognize that you know those initiatives are only going to take us so far. Like there's so much global inequality and the evening up power that technology has today means that if you're destitute in a country that has very little likelihood of increasing your status financially, there are going to be options to you that some percentage of that population is going to take. So I think working on global inequality is important and understanding that it has impacts far out things. I think it's a long, it is difficult to ask policy to address the problem we have in front of us. Like I think Derek's discussion about how big the problem is, and it's not just how big, it's how varied. Like there's no other like kind of area of work that I can think of where you routinely come across both state sponsored actors and criminals and politically motivated actors as well. There are so many things that make someone get into offensive work that I don't know that we're going to be able to meaningfully affect it. We will certainly have victories, and I think recovering for victims is probably the most important thing that I heard, particularly out of Derek's work. I think that's the thing that has the greatest impact. Um, but in terms of a defender taking any solace in the slow machinations of governments to work together, I think you kind of end up feeling like you're kind of out on your own right now as we're entering this multipolar world. There are parts of the world that are more parts of the world that are definitely against the West and are less likely to cooperate as we move forward. And I think it just increasingly isolates defenders and kind of puts them out on their own rock.
Yeah, and that's really the focus of this conversation overall, right? Is how we navigate that crazy multipolar world, as you said. So we're at, coming close to the end here. I want to take an opportunity for sort of final thoughts, and um, I would be remiss if I didn't ask. It's been up already a few times, but if I didn't ask where you see AI impacting all the things we talked about in the next few years. So let's just go around and do some final thoughts before we close out. Derek?
Okay, so and by the way, I agree with Matt. Like, this is the whole issue. We're not going to be able to eradicate cybercrime overnight, just like we have had physical crime for almost since humanity has existed, right? So I think that's the negative side, of course, but the positive side is we can do more and more work. It goes back to with AI. I mean, it goes back to that risk management aspect. I mean, how can you best mitigate that threat? And it is a powerful tool if implemented properly, of course. We're not just talking about large language models, but the whole strategy framework around that, securing attacks against those models, because there's going to be more and more of those. Doing DLP, all the different things, all the different risk elements, so you can properly adopt the powerful tools for defense. And I think when implemented properly, we do get into this, or we will get into this convergence zone. What I mean by that, if you have like level one, level two, level three SOC maturity, and level one, you're still, you're relying on automation. You have maybe some a sim in there, but not like full SOAR orchestration and so forth. So your gap is much larger. I mean, offense is always easier than defense. There's a larger gap. As you get into level two, that gap gets closed further and further. Level three, and when you have that uplifting, right, with the AI models being able to triage, help with triaging and detection and filtering, like Wendy was saying, from billions of events into tens of thousands, that is the way forward. That does mitigate. I mean, like Matt was even talking about also, okay, 100,000 CVEs, but what ones are relevant to you? Having visibility across that supply chain, that's where the tooling becomes really popular. And I, I am an optimist in that aspect. I think if organizations do solve those problems and properly adopt it, that gap can be narrowed significantly. And let's be honest, the industry, I mean, when we talk about AI, this has been largely developed by the industry. Attackers are just trying to ride on the coattails of that to abuse those engines and attack them. So I think there is some good news, but it does require adoption of this in the right way, not in the wrong way, and then ripping it apart and rebuilding it again.
Yeah, I think you have to learn your lessons from what we learned from supply chain, right? You don't want to make AI the center of your security solution. You want AI being the tool that your humans are using, because if the AI becomes part of your security problem, now you're in a real serious bucket of problems. Um, but what I also say beyond that, where I see AI working, kind of comes back to that visibility thing that I was saying earlier. If you have enormous visibility into your enterprise, you're not gonna have a human level capacity to sift through that data, right? So having an AI who can understand what's normal, what's not normal, and then bring that to the SOC's attention and be like, what does the SOC think? What do you want to do? I think that's where I see the next stage of AI is. It's very easy for certain components of technology to kind of dismiss AI or say that it's unsafe or whatever. But the fact is that it is coming, and even if you look back to like the internet crash of the early 2000s, um, the internet did become a massive change to our society. It's the foundation of the problem that we're talking about today. So I said early on, I'm suspicious of AI, but AI was different than like than blockchain felt, where it was kind of like limited in use. AI is going to be broad. AI has capacities to help. You just can't buy into all the hype. You have to look at it, how it applies in your situation, and work with the tools that are coming out on the security side, and hopefully that'll help you get a better understanding of what your enterprise is like.
Yeah, it sounds like we all agree kind of on the need for AI in cybersecurity, right? To conduct these detections at a faster speed, a greater volume, to be able to fight what the attackers are doing. I think the one piece that I would add to that is the need for cybersecurity for AI, meaning, when we look at like a lot of the attacks that have occurred so far, it's largely attackers using AI to fuel their attacks faster, to be able to do them at greater speed and scale. But we haven't seen yet in mass the attackers actually targeting AI and attacking AI in order to accomplish their objectives, right? We have a wide variety of smaller examples, but what that means is like when we look at like, okay, an organization's just adopted a new model in their environment, but like our own research has showed up to 88% success rate of manipulation of prompt injection for major LLMs. Attackers are doing that every day. So we really have an opportunity, as Matt said, to like not repeat some of the mistakes of the past with the internet age, maybe even with cloud security as we look towards some of these technology transformations. And if we can truly embed cybersecurity within AI, have that by design, have it in, I mean, we can now do like red team testing, for example, from an AI capacity. So it's continuous. It used to be that like, a great organization would do red teaming at a quarterly basis. And we would say, wow, that's really best of breed there, and best practice. Now we can integrate that into like continuous testing on a minute by minute basis, to be evaluating these. So we've got a lot of opportunity moving forward for I think cybersecurity to really truly make an impact. And for those of us that are still optimists despite being in this field for decades, I think that's something that we can look forward to if we do it the right way.
Yeah, great stuff. A lot of food for thought. Great conversation. Thank you, all of you, Wendy, Derek, Matt, for joining me for this conversation and doing this time. And thank you for your participation with CTA. We got to stay optimistic, right? So for that, we'll wrap it up. Thanks again, and happy holidays, everyone.